Are you a criminal? One suspects that most of you are answering no, but our next guest will help us address the possibility that many of us might be breaking state laws and we don't even know about them. James Copland is Senior Fellow and Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute. He has studied the problem of overcriminalization in North Carolina. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.
So, first of all, before we get into some of the details of your research, when we're talking about this general topic of overcriminalization, as I just mentioned, what are we talking about?
We're really talking about a couple things. One is the multiplication in the number of things that are considered criminal. The sort of traditional things we think about when we think about criminals are murder, rape, assault, robbery. I mean, everyone knows these are bad. But these so-called malum prohibitum offenses, or things that are prohibited because they're against regulatory codes, aren't so self-evidently wrong. Not turning in the right form, not posting the right sign. And these have multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And at the federal level, there's estimated more than 300,000 federal crimes. And we started saying, well, let's look at the state level. We think maybe this is happening at the state level too. So I looked first at New York, where the Manhattan Institute's located, and then I looked at North Carolina, and lo and behold, we see the same thing here.
So when you're talking about the term that you used, which I heard and said, I don't think many of our listeners have ever heard this term before, what you're talking about is something that would have, normally we think is a government rule, and this is somehow turning into a crime.
Yes, exactly. The Latin term I used, unless they saw the movie Legally Blonde, wouldn't be on the lips of anyone who didn't go to law school. But these are wrong, not because they're inherently bad, like robbery, but because they violate a government rule. And there may be reasons for these rules, but traditionally you had to have a guilty mind as well as a guilty act to be guilty of a criminal offense. That's been eroded over time at both the federal and state level. So innocent individuals, small businesses, family farms can get themselves into trouble without even realizing they're doing anything wrong.
And is this as much a problem in North Carolina as you feared it might be when you started looking into this?
Unfortunately, yes. And as it is with the federal level, it's actually impossible currently to figure out what is criminal in North Carolina, to actually total all the crimes. But one thing we did, and used a methodology developed by Jeff Welty, who's a professor at the School of Government at UNC Chapel Hill, was look at the criminal code in North Carolina. And we found that code has 765 sections, which is more than 5 times as many as the model penal code that the American Law Institute developed. It's also 55% larger than Virginia's and 38% larger than South Carolina's. So we said this is something the legislature ought to think about. But that doesn't even capture all the crimes, because there's a lot of crimes in other statutes in North Carolina that aren't in the criminal code. And when we looked at the new rate of crime creation that the General Assembly was doing, they were creating more than 34 new crimes a year. And in fact, the last year we counted in 2016, they created more than 80 new crimes. But the majority of these new crimes aren't in the criminal code. They're somewhere else. They may be in the fish and wildlife or the environmental laws or the health laws. So it's very difficult for people to figure out if they're doing something wrong. Now, granted, a big business with a team of lawyers, in-house counsel, and fancy law firms, they can figure out the rules more or less. But that doesn't leave a lot of hope for the small business, the entrepreneur, the family farmer, and those are the folks that often create the most jobs.
We are chatting with Jim Copland, Senior Fellow and Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute. With a criminal code that's that large, and with crimes that are outside the criminal code and elsewhere in the general statutes, is it possible for anyone, even the people who know the most about the law in North Carolina, to have a good sense of just what is legal and what isn't legal in the state?
I would say no. Obviously, trained lawyers that work in a specific specialty will have a pretty good idea about what's legal and illegal in their specialty. But actually, just reading through all of these, and it's important to understand, even if you understood everything in the statute books in North Carolina, that wouldn't cover you. because a lot of laws create regulatory authority with various state agencies and commissioners, and their rules become automatically criminal. And in fact, even professional licensing boards, and we need some of these licensing boards in certain areas. I think we overdo it, but in areas like healthcare, medicine, dentistry, obviously we need certain licensing boards. But a lot of times the state gives the rules of these licensing boards criminal effect as well. What that means is you've got lots and lots of crimes in North Carolina that the legislature itself never even voted on and may not be aware that this is actually something that's considered criminal under their own state's laws.
Okay, so we've spelled out a problem. There are lots of crimes, including lots of crimes that no one even has any awareness of. What do we do about it?
Well, we lay out in our reports some ideas, but one I want to focus on here today is one that certain members of the General Assembly have really gotten jump-started, but it hasn't happened yet. And Dennis Rydell, a representative from Alamance County, has taken some of the lead on establishing a recodification commission of the criminal code. Now, it's sort of an axiom in my line of work. Well, if you want to really kill an idea, set up a commission. So this commission has to be set up properly. You have to have the right people on it. It has to have real deadlines, and it has to have its recommendations need to be taken seriously by the legislature once it does that. But if you could actually clean up the code, getting rid of the crimes that don't make any sense, those that involve borrowing mules and things from the agricultural era, those that aren't used, making some of the crimes that are currently crimes actually civil offenses, making sure that the intent provisions are right in all the code, and finally just making it organized so that someone could try to figure out what's criminal and what's not, what's against the rules and what isn't. That could go a long way. So I hope the state will give that some due consideration.
Is there any potential positive impact, say economically, to fixing this issue?
Oh, I think so. It's part and parcel of the reform agenda that's been going on that's I think been quite positive overall here in North Carolina. Reducing tax rates, but in a responsible way where the fiscal budget looks good, and paring down regulations. But when you come down to criminal law, I mean, criminal law has a bit more bite than just a civil regulation. And again, it's the small business owner, it's the entrepreneur, it's the family farmer that's not going to be able to figure these things out. And there's a lot of evidence out there that these really create jobs. I mean, if you look at some of the fantastic job growth here in the Research Triangle Park, a lot of the jobs have been created by companies that didn't exist 20 years ago. Well, if you've got a criminal code that puts entrepreneurs in jeopardy, you're discouraging precisely that type of behavior that generates economic growth for the whole state.
When people hear about this issue, do they generally come on board fairly quickly and say, yeah, we need to do something about this?
I think so. I think once people understand what we're talking about is the proliferation of business crimes. We're not talking about letting violent criminals back out on the streets. And in fact, the Manhattan Institute, where I work, is known for helping to clean up the violent crime in New York City. But when they realize that we're talking about making this more comprehensible, and granted, let's say some of the folks, the more progressive-leaning people out there think, oh, we really need to regulate business more, but let's do it in a logical way and in a way that gives people notice. Those folks are sensitive to saying we're not going to put in jail people for making innocent mistakes, and often it's when it comes to occupational licensing and things like that, it's some of these small business owners that get entrapped in it are minorities and other people who don't have the resources to hire a bunch of lawyers.